Erev Tov, good evening everybody. Baruch haba, it is good to see you. First of all, my special thanks to Avital Magalis. Not sure where she is. Oh, over there. Thank you very much for arranging this and making sure that this room is available to us. And obviously very much welcome to Rabbi Francis Nataf and Rabbi Dr. Eugene Korn. Rabbi Francis is well known in our circles here. He is our former educational director, and he is the author of many important books which are to be found over there to your right on Chumash. He's writing a compilation on all the 5 Chumashim and many essays in many papers, journals, newspapers. And Rabbi Eugene, Dr. Eugene Korn, is also a very good friend of ours. He came on Aliyah not so long ago, and he's the American director for Jewish-Christian cooperation in Efrat, and he's also the co-director of the Institute of Theological Inquiry. He's the editor of Me'orot, a form of modern Orthodox discourse. Before we start the lecture or the discussion, I just want to mention that anybody who does not get our weekly thoughts to ponder and other information of our school, please fill in afterwards your name and your email address, and we will make sure that it will come to you from next week onwards, every week on Thursday, the diuk, as they say. Friends, in front of you, you have a quotation of our famous Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, who passed away shortly to our great regret. He was a very famous thinker, halachic authority, rabbinical personality, Rosh Yeshiva. And as you can see on this page, there is a very disturbing observation about or by him concerning the relationship between the Torah world today and non-Jewish suffering around the world. I just read one part of it and it will say it all. Painful and in need of discussion. Rabbi Lichtenstein Zal writes, the tendency prevalent in much of the contemporary Torah world of total obliviousness to non-Jewish suffering is shamefully deplorable. That's the point which he makes in a very famous essay of his in one of his books. You have the actual source in front of you. And it is that statement, the tendency prevalent in much of the contemporary Torah world of almost total obliviousness to non-Jewish suffering is shamefully deplorable, which is the topic of tonight. This is not a small matter. And I tell you why I wanted to discuss this and why I invited these great gentlemen to come and share this with me. Only a few weeks ago, we had the terrible earthquake in Nepal. Actually, there were 2, as you know. And at the same moment when that happened, the Israeli government straight away got up, sent siyua, as we call it in Hebrew, help to many of these people, doctors, nurses, field hospitals, including Zaka, for those who know what that is. And obviously Chabad was there all the time to help out and have done a fantastic job, as they always do. But there was complete silence about this tragedy on the side of our chief rabbinate here in Israel. The yeshiva world, and I've looked around carefully, has not responded to this. Not only the Haredi world, but even the modern Orthodox world. we didn't hear their voice anywhere, except for the fact that in America a few Orthodox shuls brought money together to help the people out over there. I tried to get some Orthodox organizations to organize together with me an evening at the Kotel, at the Wailing Wall, just to pray for the victims of Nepal. It was completely ignored. I had hoped that we were able to organize a huge evening gathering of Orthodox Jews, or for that reason in shuls, in synagogues, or in yeshivot, or that there would be a misheberach, as we say, Shabbat morning, in Shabbat morning prayers, or perhaps musar shmus, as we say in Yiddish, in the yeshivot, about our concern for the non-Jewish world, for the victims in Nepal, quoting Chazal, the rabbis, about our relationship and our commitment and obligations towards the non-Jewish world. Exactly that what Rabbi Lichtenstein speaks about. But there was only silence, complete silence. All what I did on the end was, many of you have probably received it, was a small prayer which I wrote, which everybody can say on his own in Hebrew or in English, but silence was the response. This is not the first time that this happened. In other occasions years ago, when there were tsunamis in the Far East, again the secular Jewish community in Israel, the Israeli community, came out enormously, beyond imagination. Money, food, sending nurses, soldiers, everybody to these particular places. And again, there was more or less complete silence on the side of the Orthodox. When I wrote about this and sent this little prayer, I got a few responses which are unbelievable. The responses were mainly that the people in Nepal are all Ovdei Avodah Zarah, they're all idol worshippers, we should not pray for them, and we should be very pleased that all their temples have been destroyed. If not for the fact that it is a tragedy, one would have to laugh about this. But that is the response which I got. I do not know exactly how many people got killed by now, but it is at least 10,000, but there are probably many more. We know that there are millions of people over there without a home. We know for sure that children and babies are dying in the streets. Loads of children are walking around looking for their parents and can't find them if they're still alive. There is no water, there is no food, a complete disaster. And there is no Orthodox response. This is, in my opinion, absolutely shocking. I call this a Chilul Hashem, a desecration of God's name. And I feel terribly embarrassed as an Orthodox rabbi and Jew that something like that can happen. Imagine that something like that would happen to us and the world around us would not respond. What would we say? Now, just a very quick observation. To use the argument that all of them are Ovdei Avodah Zarah, which seems to go around a lot, they're all idol worshippers. Well, first of all, that halachically and from a Jewish perspective does not make any sense whatsoever. If you look in Sefer Bereshit, in the first book of the Torah, you will constantly see that Avram, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, our great pillars on which the whole Jewish tradition stands, were constantly busy trying to make peace, to help, to make sure that people are well, while they were Ovdei Avodah Zarah. They were idol worshippers. If you want to read very carefully about it, you should just read the introduction of the Netziv, the famous Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, one of the great and the last Rosh Yeshiva of Voloshin, where he writes in a short introduction, which is outstanding, that the reason why Sefer Bereshit is called Sefer HaYashar, which is a second name for this particular work. Yashar means straight, righteous, many different translations possible, is because Avram, Yitzhak and Yaakov were very concerned about the welfare of idol worshippers. They didn't agree with them, sure, but when it came to their welfare, there was absolutely no question about it. Besides the fact, by the way, that probably Hinduism and Buddhism are not at all idol worship. If you want to read more about that, then I suggest that you read this book. One of the editors is sitting over here, called Jewish Theology and World Religions, where there is a very strong argument made that Buddhism is definitely not idol worship, and Hinduism is possibly also not idol worship. If you know the ins and the outs of these particular religions, you know it is very different from what the general population is telling us about these religions. But anyway, this is a very sincere and a very important matter. The three of us tonight will take on this challenge and say what we have to say about it. We will do this. Each one will speak about a quarter of an hour, 20 minutes. After that, there will be a little discussion between the three of us, and then we open it to the public, and whoever wants to speak, ask questions, make observations, please do so. So let me start first with somehow analyzing the problem, what's going on over here. It is so shocking that it is even difficult to speak about it because of the enormous embarrassment which goes along with this. Anyway, what we need to do is to try to understand how did we get in this situation that we do not respond to the world around us as Orthodox Jews, especially when they are suffering tremendously like in Nepal. Second thing is the question, obviously, how should we solve this problem? If this is really a certain attitude, a certain outlook to life on the side of the Orthodox world, then we have to understand what can we do to change that. These are the two major issues over here. Now let it be very clear, we have to be extremely honest about this. It is definitely true that the Jewish tradition has, let's call it, an ambivalent look to the non-Jewish world. If you look in the Talmud, if you look in the Mishnah, if you look in the Midrash, you get very many different voices. Some of them are very beautiful. How much we have to be concerned about the non-Jewish world, that we are the chosen people and therefore we have to be an example to them, we have to look after them, we have to be concerned about their welfare. There are many, and if you want to read the whole article or essay of Rabbi Lichtenstein, which is mentioned on this first page, then you will see many quotations there from the Talmud, how much we are responsible for the world around us. But it can neither be denied that there are also observations within the Talmud which are highly unsympathetic about the Gentile world. In other words, there are different views here, and we have to try to understand what actually is doing. Now I'm going to speak for a moment and giving you a few examples within the Halacha you probably all know, which are not so nice. I remind you, I'm speaking from a theoretical point of view because the Halacha, le ma'aseh as we say, the practical Halacha may be different. But for example, in principle, I'm not saying that that is the way how we behave, but in principle one is not allowed to save the life of a non-Jew on Shabbat. There is also a statement concerning not trusting them. You probably know about the law of Yayin Nesech. That is that if you bring a kosher bottle of wine, but it is touched or moved by a non-Jew when it is already open, we are no longer allowed to drink it. We have a law which is called Bishul Akum. When non-Jews have cooked our food, we are not allowed to eat it. There is a very, very disturbing law in the Torah itself, in the Bible itself, Lot Techamem. You shall not have any favor on them, which is basically speaking about the 7 nations who used to live in the land of Israel when Joshua entered, but it was applied by the sages on all the non-Jews. Don't do them any favors. There is this very remarkable and unusual concept which we all know about called the Shabbos Goy. That if we are not allowed to do something on Shabbat, we call in a non-Jew who does it for us. Also not without its problems, to be quite honest. If we would have a Sunday Jew, and not only a Shabbos Goy, I could live with it. But we don't have a Sunday Jew where we go out to help them for things they are not allowed to do on Sunday. I have not yet heard about this. If you look in the Kabbalah in Jewish mystical thinking, you will see some very unpleasant statements made about the non-Jews, going to the point that they are the Sitra Achra, which means something like they belong to the other side of the world where there's a lot of impurity. And I don't want to quote some other statements by the Kabbalah because I'm too embarrassed to do so. But I hope you get the picture. And the question is, how does this come about? How did that get into the Jewish tradition? Because it seems to go straight against our whole value system. We are the chosen people. We are being told to be a light to the nations. We are being told that we have to have mercy on the non-Jewish world to help them out. And then suddenly we get statements like this, which obviously completely contradict exactly what other sages and the Talmud is saying. But the Talmud itself is full of paradoxes about this particular matter. Now the first thing to remember, and that's most important, is that when the Talmud or earlier sources and the Torah itself speaks about the non-Jew, it indeed speaks about Ovdei Avodah Zara. The non-Jewish world at the time, especially in the Middle East, was full of idol worship. Now, idol worship in itself may not be the worst thing in the world. The problem is that it is very often identified with brutality, with sexual license, with child offerings, with abuse. There's a lot of evil. This seems to go hand in hand whenever you look in our sources, which is probably exactly the historical situation under which, at the time, the non-Jewish world was functioning. That, by the way, doesn't mean that all the non-Jews at the time were terribly bad, but the overall picture, at least in the Middle East, was like that, and probably beyond the Middle East. That created, within the Torah itself, and also afterwards within the Talmud, a certain animosity by the sages against the non-Jewish world, because basically they felt that we should stay away from these people purely because we didn't want to get influenced by all their evil actions and their evil thoughts. And since we had to become a holy nation, we should keep distance. And some of these laws I just mentioned have a lot to do with that and are rooted in that particular case. Later on, we cannot imagine it anymore, but just go back a few hundred years in Jewish history in Europe, the anti-Semitism was overwhelming. Jews were killed left and right, pogroms, inquisitions, also terrible things where millions of Jews lost their lives. Obviously at the time, the sages felt that they could not do anything else but to continue with these kind of laws to make a separation between us and them. Because what was there to learn from them, and where should we become friendly with them if this is the way how they dealt with us? Also, that is very understandable. But how closer we get to our age, we already see that there is a change in the non-Jewish world. That cannot be denied. First of all, the fact is that many of the Gentiles stopped worshipping idols. Many of them became Christians. Many of them started to believe in one God, and felt also that basics on which the biblical ethics stand should become part of their lives as well, which we even see in the teachings of Yeshua, of Jesus, of Paul, and you see this also in the New Testament, cannot be denied. So slowly but surely over the years, there was a change within the non-Jewish world. It became less violent because of that reason as well. Many of them accepted more or less the 10 Commandments. And idol worship was basically put aside. The first person who actually made that point and asked the question, can we continue to consider the non-Jewish world to be idol worshippers, was one of the greatest rabbinical figures of a few hundred years ago, and who was called Menachem Meiri. I suppose that many of us have heard about him, who said that the Gentiles of today are no longer of the Avodah Zarah, they are no longer idol worshippers, and therefore all these laws, or most of these laws which apply to the idol worshippers, don't apply to these particular people. Not that he did away with all these laws, but he said definitely many of them are no longer applicable. Some also people followed and said the same thing, but the problem was, and this is a major problem, is that while the Meiri was of that opinion and he was a major authority, his law or his view was not accepted by most of the other poskim, halachic authorities, and it is not codified in Halacha, in the Shulchan Aruch, in the Codex of Jewish law, which more or less seems to keep to the old picture. Now I want you for a moment to understand what happens over here, without going into many details. And if you be so kind to look to the second page, I want to read with you a part of an essay I just wrote for a rabbinical journal in America, which says something about this matter and how I personally see this problem. The whole article is called The Need for Redemptive Halacha, but here are just a few points. I quote, "Over the years, however, these laws, that are the laws we are now speaking about, have taken on a life of their own. They have created a psychological condition," and please take care of what I'm saying over here, "among many religious Jews that exceeds by far what the sages wanted to accomplish. Since these laws were never officially abolished, they created an ontological view of non-Jews." What does that mean, an ontological view of non-Jews? No matter what their beliefs, non-Jews no matter what their beliefs, non-Jews are by definition idol worshippers and depraved people. This is their very nature, and they cannot escape it. This view on the part of many religious Jews is not conscious or deliberate, but it is deeply ingrained in the Jewish religious psyche. It points to a kind of Jungian archetype. What this means, please take notice, is that many religious Jews believe not only that these laws should not be changed, but also that non-Jews are not meant to and are unable to change. After all, these laws reflect Judaism's authentic view of non-Jews. In other words, there is nothing wrong with the Jewish tradition having these laws for still applying these laws. On the contrary, there is something wrong with the non-Jewish world for changing and no longer fitting the description that the Jewish tradition attributes to them. This attitude is tragic and extremely dangerous. It completely contradicts one of the most important teachings of the Jewish tradition, that is, that man, Jew or Gentile, can and must change for the better. In fact, this belief is not only a misrepresentation of the Jewish tradition, it is the very antithesis of all that what Judaism stands for. In other words, we are considered to be the chosen people. We have to be a light to the nations. What is the point of being a light to the nations and being an example to them if they can't change? If they stay what they always were, then we are out of a job, because there's no point for us to be a light to the nations to them. But that's exactly the crucial issue, in my opinion, what is going on. Now, you may argue with me and say, Rabbi Cardozo, you're overlooking a fundamental issue. And that is it really true that the non-Jewish world has changed at all? It's very nice for you to say this. But it is true there's no longer Avodah Zarah today, at least not in the old-fashioned way, idol worship. But cruelty, immorality, the lack of civilization is still around us everywhere. And if you think about what happened to us in 1940, 1945, then that would be the biggest objection against what I just said, where 6 million Jews were killed at the hands of the Gentile world. But I think that we should not fall into this pit. Because the truth is that lots has changed. True, the Holocaust took place, and one can't underestimate the evil which was done over there. But at the same time, when we look around today, we have to remember that millions, if not billions, of non-Jews around us are fine, great people of tremendous integrity who are on our side. We sometimes forget this in Israel because we're always speaking about the anti-Semitism, but remember, we have loads of friends in this world, many, many more friends than there are anti-Semitic people around. While it is true, and I will admit that straight away, that in certain circles cruelty is definitely there. ISIS is a typical example of that. That some of them are growing is also true. They make a lot of noise in this world, and we always speak about them. But by doing so, we take things out of proportion because we forget about all those others who are not part of this world and are civilized and good people. And that's exactly the point. This world of cruelty, even today, is no longer the definition of the representation of the non-Jewish world. In the meantime, we have societies which have linked themselves up and have legalized important moral conditions by which man has to live, especially in the West. And the exception proves the rule. In other words, the world is a much better place than many thousands of years ago, perhaps even hundreds of years ago. And I remind you one fact, we Jews should really know about that, because just go back a few generations, and we, the Jews, were not allowed to be part of civilization in any sense of the word. Universities were closed for us. Most forms of businesses were closed for us. We were pushed in the corner, into the ghettos. This has changed. Yes, there is anti-Semitism today, that's even growing. But let's keep the proportions where they should be and not overdo this, however much we suffer still from anti-Semitism. Which means the following. And this is very, very important. I call Jewish history, and I'm not the first one to do that, redemptive history. In German you say Heilsgeschichte. That means to say that the Jewish tradition is of the opinion that mankind will move forward to the better, while there are certain gaps, terrible gaps like the Holocaust. Still, the ultimate goal of the Jewish people is to move the whole of mankind into an even higher moral condition by way of the Torah, by way of the Sheva Mitzvot Children in Noah, the 7 commandments of Noah, and many other important laws. And this is also part of the duty of Halacha. I therefore, in this article, I speak about redemptive Halacha. Redemptive Halacha means to say that one of the most important functions of the Halacha is to make sure that when we apply it, it applies in such a way that the world becomes a better place because of it. And once the Halacha has achieved these goals, then certain, here please well, certain halachot can be put aside. They did the job, and we move on to the next project, for which there are also halachot. Now, do not misunderstand me. I'm not saying that the whole of halacha works like that, and we can just do away whenever something is outdated, let's say. That's definitely not true. But when it comes to the question, or better, the issue which we are discussing over here, I believe that is very much the case. In other words, there is something which we can call redemptive halacha. It will accomplish something by its laws, and once these laws have done what they need to do, we have to put them aside, because to now continue to apply them doesn't make any sense. Therefore, some of the laws which we find concerning non-Jews, like the Meiri already has indicated, no longer apply, because the conditions for which they were created are no longer with us. The old-fashioned Avodah Zarah, idol worship, is more or less defeated. Much of that is because of the Jewish tradition, via Christianity, via the Islam. We are now coming in a different stage, perhaps, to make sure that people try even harder to become moral, to be more gold intoxicated, as we can say. We are speaking today, look around in the world, most nations in the world, especially in the West, have accepted the concept of human dignity, of equality, that evil cannot be part of the law, equity, there are human rights, there are human duties. Even the way how we fight wars today is much more limited than it was in the past. In any way, there has been a movement forward in the right direction. While it is true that some people keep on violating them in a most terrible way, but that's not the general picture of mankind as such. Eliezer Berkowitz, one of the greatest thinkers of our time, wrote about the fact that we have a problem in the Jewish community, and that is that throughout the last 2,000 years, because of our experience with the non-Jewish world, a lot of what he calls defensive halacha was created. Defenses in saying like, let's keep away from the non-Jews because we need to survive in this galut, in this exile, and therefore we have to build very high walls between us and them. That's the only way how we can survive. But, says Rabbi Berkowitz, now that we are back in our homeland, the rules of the game have completely changed. We are no longer living in the kind of exile like we were in Poland and in Russia and places like that. We have our own army, we have our own government, we have loads of different conditions, which makes us to be spiritually and physically living in completely different conditions. Berkowitz therefore calls onto the halachic community to take this into account and say, defensive halacha was good for exile, but it is not good for the state of Israel, and where Jews find themselves today, even outside Israel. So what is happening is this. There has been created, for the reasons I mentioned before, an ontological view on the non-Jew. Ontological means to say something which is basic, which cannot be changed, and therefore the larger Jewish religious community, not all of them, but many of them, see the non-Jews still like we saw them thousands of years ago. An idol worshipper, an evil person, a person who only does a lot of bad. But we did not update the halacha. We did not follow the road of the Meiri and some people after that. And therefore, this ontological approach concerning the non-Jew is still with us. If I have discussions, which I often have with Bachorei Yeshiva of the Haredi Yeshivot, I learned myself for 12 years in Haredi Yeshivot. But even when I have discussions here in Israel with some modern Orthodox Yeshivot students, and you ask them what do they think about the non-Jewish world, then this is exactly what I just told you. They're all of the Avodah Zarah. They're all idol worshippers. Most of them have no kesher at all with the non-Jewish world, except for the Arab world, do not know what is going on, have no idea about Christianity or anything like that, have no idea about morality, which is moving around today in a most positive sense of the word, and therefore they're stuck in this old-fashioned, outdated ontological idea about what non-Jewish people are all about. What this means is only one thing. You don't need to change the Halacha, because the original non-defensive Halacha tells us a very different story. We need to have clear distinctions between us and them. We should not assimilate, we should not marry out or anything like that, because we have a function as a light to the nations, and that we must keep under all circumstances alive to be able to do that. But many of the other issues, and the whole concept, the whole view, the Weltanschauung on the non-Jew, needs a radical change. But as long as our poskim, our halachic authorities, do not make this in an official, new way, telling us that indeed we need to change about it, that particular picture just continues and applies itself many times over, as we can today clearly see within the yeshiva world, which I love, but the truth about it is, these are the facts. Obviously, there are exceptions to the rule. Rabbi Lichtenstein tried very hard to break this particular ontological attitude. I do not know to what extent he was successful in doing all that. I add one more dimension to this. What is so interesting is that today, we in Israel, we no longer deal with the world from a defensive perspective. We have an army here, and if they attack us, we will fight back. We are no longer afraid for this world out there. And therefore we were able to do tremendous great things in this country. Unbelievable things. But it's only because we stopped being defensive. And what I can only say is, Halacha needs to stop to be defensive. The time has come to do this. But our leadership has not done much about this, with one or two exceptions. This is important. What we have to realize is that there was a change in the non-Jewish world for the best. Not only that they can change, they also have changed. Why then continue with a picture which is by now totally outdated? I finish with the following observations. I ask that to all of you, including myself. How many of us have actually prayed for the people of Nepal in the last few weeks? And we do so? Have we done so? How much have we done so? Have we indeed made a gathering at the kotel? We didn't. I have not seen in my shul a Mishaberach, and when I spoke with some of the people about it, they didn't know what I was speaking about when I asked them to make that particular prayer. In the meantime, there are hundreds of thousands of people out there suffering tremendously, children, babies, and so on. Have we not prayed for them? This is in complete opposition to what the Jewish tradition stands for. If we don't, then we are missing the boat as far as our own function and our own purpose in this world is all about. More than that, let me tell you something else. Many secular Israelis are very upset about this, because they therefore think that this is the official reading of the Jewish tradition, and tell us in very clear terms, I don't want to have anything to do with Judaism, and definitely not with Orthodox Judaism, if you are not even able to pray for these non-Jews. We are sending our boys over there, we are putting up hospitals over there, and where are you? So what kind of example are we giving to them? In fact, how bad a stigma are we actually putting on the whole of the Jewish tradition that way? Many people speak about a form of racism on our side because we don't seem to care too much. I can only call from here, whatever you can do about that yeshivot should start speaking about this problem. And once and for all. Shuls should be speaking about these problems, giving lectures on it, what Chazal, the rabbis, really have to say about it. High schools should do so, and so on, and so on. Because if we continue to stick with an outdated understanding of the non-Jewish world, we will do tremendous damage, first of all on the non-Jewish world, secondly on ourselves, on the Orthodox Jewish tradition, which after all is the original tradition, And we must make sure that it does not fall into that gap and starts to make enormous problems which later on we won't anymore know how to get out of. My dear friends, I have much more to say about this. I shall not do so, and I will ask Rabbi Dr. Eugene Korn to continue the conversation. Bavakasha.
Thank you, Kavod, Rabbi Cardozo and Rabbi Nataf. I agree completely with your bottom line, Rav Natan. But I think that the problem is not Halacha. The problem is not this category of Avodah Zarah. That is not why we are indifferent and we don't care about Gentile suffering. I think Avodah Zarah, the citing, and usually it's an inaccurate citing of Avodah Zarah by people, is an excuse for their laziness, for their moral turpitude, and it's an easy way to escape the demands that the Torah and Yadut impose upon us. Let me try to explore this more from a psychological and a theological point of view. And by the way, 600 years before the Meiri, Rabbi Yochanan, the 6th century Amora, proclaimed, and this became normative halacha, that Nachrim b'chutz la'aretz eino avodah zarah, ela masei avotehem b'yadehem. Independent of whatever religion they have, these people are not in the category of Ovdei Avodah Zarah. So that's why I say that the appeal to Avodah Zarah is an excuse. The real issue is a cultural issue, it's a historical issue, it's an existential issue about what makes us tick as Jews today. Now, to live as a Torah Jew is to live with a very difficult tension, a dialectical tension between our commitment to particular Jewish identity and a universal identity with all humanity. That's a tough tension to live with. I myself am disturbed by that tension almost every day. And this is not a modern problem. It was always this way. I mean, think of the first Jew, think of Avram Avinu. Avram Avinu is an Ivri, and everybody learned the Rashi, everybody knows what Ivri means. Avram was on one side, and the rest of the world was on the other side. So Avram was supposed to be isolated from the rest of humanity. He was different as a Jew. It doesn't say he was ontologically different, but he was different. He was in a different place. On the other hand, Avram Avinu felt a moral responsibility for the Rashayim and for the evil people of Stone. He didn't say, well, I'm on one side and what do I care what God does with the Rashayim and the Tzaddikim of Stone and Amor? The Goyim, right? The Goyim, why should I care? No. Avram Avinu is a model for us because he cared and he was mispalel and he even argued with the Kadosh Baruch Hu about not punishing the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. So Avram also had this tension between the Ivri who was on one side and was opposed to the world, and yet was part of a larger humanity and felt a moral and a religious obligation, to come to the aid and to identify with the suffering of the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. And by the way, we're B'nai Abraham. Why are B'nai Abraham? Why are we not B'nai Noach? There was somebody who just didn't care about the rest of humanity. Way before, 10 generations before Abraham Avinu, Noach, when God told Noach that he was going to destroy the rest of humanity, except for the rest of humanity, and the only people who would survive would be Noach and his family, right? What did Noach do? He didn't start to argue with God the way Abraham. He said, okay, he says, I'll build my ark, I'll survive, and the rest of humanity, what do I care about? The Goyim. No, That's one of the reasons why we're B'nai Avraham and not B'nai Noah, because we have an obligation to be part of humanity. And by the way, if you think this is a lamentable situation, this is a situation that ought not to be, we're kind of trapped in this. Truth is, that's the ideal of the Torah, to live with this tension. At Har Sinai, Shavuot is in a couple nights. We'll remember, we'll reenact Matan Torah at Har Sinai. So what does the Kadosh Baruch Hu say to Am Yisrael at Har Sinai? Tiyu li mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh. And the truth is that those two concepts exhibit a tension. Think about what it is to be a mamlechet kohanim. Well, first of all, think what it is to be a goy kadosh. Kadosh means separate, transcendent, different, distant, unable to reach. So to be a goy kadosh means to be a separate people, to be isolated. That's one ideal of Jewish life, of the Torah for us. But concurrent with that ideal is this notion that God tells us we must be a mamlechet kohanim. Now, not too many people think about this. One of the people who thought about it was the Netziv that Rabbi Cardozo quoted. The Netziv says as follows. What's a Kohen? It works very well in our community. We have Kohanim, we have Leviim, we have Yisrael. So the Kohanim bless the rest of the Kahal. The Kohanim bless the non-Kohanim, right? In the words of the Sfas Emes, a Kohen is a mitbarech and a mivarech. A Kohen is someone who is blessed and who blesses others. So in Shul, the Kohanim bless the non-Kohanim. But what could it mean to be a mamlechet Kohanim when every Jew is a Kohen? Who is left to bless? Has to be the Ummot HaOlam, the non-Jews. So part of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's objective in giving us the Torah, in making us a Goy Kadosh, is that we have to be an instrument, somehow we have to be connected to the world out there, to the Ummot HaOlam, to the Gentiles. And we have the obligation, the religious, and I would even say halachic obligation, right, to bring the blessing of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and of Torah to the world. We can't afford not to think about them. You know, when you asked the yeshiva boys, what do you think about the goyim? They say they're Ovdei Avodah. The truth is, they don't think about them at all. Right? Only when you corner them and you put them into the spot, that's when they'll say it. But the truth is, it's not their world. It's not their world. They're in a different planet. They have no connection whatsoever to the non-Jewish world. And that's the exact opposite of what the Torah tells us to be as mamlechet kohanim. We have to be involved in the world and bring blessing to the world. That's the Torah. That's not Reform Judaism. Now, that's a delicate balance. How do you secure your commitment to a particular Jewish identity, remain a Goy Kadosh, and at the same time participate in all of humanity? That's a very difficult balancing act. And most people in the religious world can't handle it, quite frankly. They can't handle it. Here's the way Rav Soloveitchik, Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik put it very beautifully. He says, we, the Jewish people, are the bearers of a double charismatic load, that of the dignity of man and the sanctity of the covenantal community. We are summoned by God, who revealed himself both at the level of the universal creation and that of a private, intimate covenant, to undertake a double mission, the universal human and the exclusive Jewish covenantal confrontation. So to live as a serious Jew is to live with this tension and to live with this dialectic, that we have to always weigh our particular Jewish identity versus our participation in all of humanity. And the Torah itself doesn't want us to just forget about humanity or the suffering of humanity. Sefer Eov. According to Chazal, Eov wasn't even a Jew. But Sefer Eov is in Tanakh because it's a story of human suffering that Gentiles experience and human suffering that Jews experience. We are sharers of the same suffering. That's what human life is about. And what does Eov say in chapter 31? And talking about his idolatrous servant, right? Eov says, "Hello, babeten oseni asahu." Is it not the case that God made me in the same womb that He made him? We're all creatures of a Kadosh Baruch Hu. And that's the view of Rabbi Akiva in the Mishnah, who says, "Chaviv Adam shenivra b'tzelem." Adam, not Yehudim. Chaviv Adam shenivra b'tzelem. Every human being is created in the image of the divine. There is a part of God, or a reflection of God, in every human being, Jew and non-Jew. We are all made in the same womb. That's the universal understanding of humanity according to the Torah. And therefore, when a great tragedy occurs in Nepal, and we are blind to it, and we don't experience the suffering, and we don't think it's something that merits our attention, I would say that's a Chilul Hashem, in the literal meaning of Chilul Hashem. It doesn't mean blasphemy. Chilul means absence or lack of. Halal is an empty space, right? So Chilul Hashem means it's a place where God is not. So you have, I think the last count was 8,600 people died in the earthquake in Nepal. And we don't see this as Siluch Hashkina, that somehow 85 images of God have now left the world. That's a Chilul Hashem. We fail to see God in the world out there. Now, doesn't the fact that every human being is created with Tzelem Elohim impose certain moral and practical and emotional obligations on us, right? As believers in God, as people who want to see God, or who are obligated to bring God into the world? So the lack of concern is not about avodah zarah. It's about a certain narrowness of culture. So the truth is that today, Am Yisrael is a traumatized people. We've been deeply traumatized by the persecutions and the killings and the hatred and the hostility and the ghettoization that the Gentile world has imposed upon us. Whether it was the Romans in the time of the Gemara, right, or the church after that in the Middle Ages, or the Enlightenment, or secularism, or radical Islam. We are a traumatized people. One of my teachers said we probably have beaten wife syndrome. And what happens when you're traumatized? What happened to the universal concern? What happened to Chaviv Adam Shenivra B'Tzelem? I'll tell you what happened. The Goyim beat it out of us. The Goyim beat it out of us with their persecution. So we remain indifferent. We become ghettoized, culturally ghettoized, and we're exclusively concerned with Jews and Jewish identity. And all the business about the Halacha and avodah zarah, is an excuse, right, to stay in your traumatized womb. We live in a cultural ghetto, and we want to live in a cultural ghetto, even though the Torah demands that we be Mamlechet Kohanim, that we be Abraham and not Noah. And it's a tragedy, it's a religious tragedy. It's Keneged the Torah for us to turn our back on the Torah's challenge for us to be Mamlechet Kohanim. And it is a Chilul Hashem. It's declaring that God does not live outside the Beis Midrash or the Jewish house or the Jewish street. Now, what's the effect on us as moral sensitive human beings. If we're indifferent to the suffering of others, doesn't this diminish us as moral and religious people? You know, Rav Amital, I don't know how many of you studied with Rav Amital or knew Rav Amital. He used to tell a story all the time. It's a story about Rav Shneir Zalman of Ladiv, of Balatanya. And the story goes that he lived in a railroad flat, and he was studying Torah one time in his flat, and he heard a baby crying. So he had his apartment, and next to him was his grandson, the Tzemach Tzedek, and in the third domicile was this baby, and the baby was crying. Nobody came to help the baby. So finally, the Rosh Shneir Zalman got up and he went over and held the baby and quieted the baby, comforted the baby. And then he went back to his grandson, who was in the middle apartment, and he said, "What's the matter? Didn't you hear the baby crying?" And the grandson, very proudly, he was a real yeshiva boy, you know, he said, "Oh, I was so involved in Torah, I didn't hear the baby crying." So Rav Shneir Zalman said, "Stop studying Torah, close the Gemara, because if you're studying Torah, it doesn't allow you to hear the baby cry, then something's very bad, something's very wrong with the way you're studying Torah." Okay. That's where we are, unfortunately, in the religious world. We're so busy in our internal affairs, studying Torah, doing this, you know, licking our wounds from past persecutions, that we don't hear the baby crying. We don't hear 85 innocent human beings in Nepal, all of whom were created with Tzelem Elokim. We just don't care about them. We just don't care about them. That's a religious tragedy. That's a Torah tragedy. That's what Rav Lichter's thing is saying. You know, there's a halacha. It's often observed in the breach. There's a halacha that a shul, or a place where you daven, has to have a window. How many people are davening in a basement minyan with no window? I used to all the time. Truth is, that's against the halacha. Why did the Balei Halacha insist that when you're in communion with God, you have to have a window? It's not that they cared about the architecture. The reason is that when you're involved with God, when you're praying to God, you have to be able to see to the outside world. You can't be in a comfortable womb and not care about the outside world, because the outside world, right, is God's world. And there's a reflection of God out there. And the greatest reflection of God, you know, where is God's glory? Ayem makom kavodo. It's not only in the stars and in the beauty of nature, it's in people. Every human being is created with Tzelem Elokim. Now, Rav Cardozo was absolutely correct, and Rav Berkovitz, who was one of my Rebbeim, you know, was absolutely correct. In Galut, we had to close up. We had to close ourselves to the outside world, because any time we got involved in the world, Jewish blood ran in the streets. That's the unfortunate truth. But that's not the case today. We live in thank God, we're blessed to live in a Jewish state with our own army, and we are strong. We don't have to have a defensive halacha. But again, the issue is not the halacha, the issue is the culture. The issue is religious Weltanschauung. We don't have to be defensive anymore. We have enemies, right? But our enemies are not the people of Nepal. What did they ever do to us to merit our indifference to them? If it happened to ISIS, I would understand. But innocent people in Nepal and Thailand and the victims of tsunamis, you know, they're not our enemies.
And ISIS aren't up there with Azara.
What?
And ISIS aren't up there with the
Well, according to the Meiri, they are. According to the Rambam, they're not. But once again, it's a fiction. It's a dangerous fiction to think that's the halacha which dictates these behaviors and these reactions and this moral indifference. It's not the halacha, it's our cultural inwardness, right, that we developed as a defensive reaction to persecution that is not what the Torah wants us to be. We are supposed to be both a goy kadosh and a mamlechet kohanim. So I personally was very saddened by the lack of attention of the religious community to the tragedy in Nepal, or the tsunami. I think it was originally the tsunami that Rabbi Lichtenstein was lamenting, that the religious community, was less concerned about the tsunami than it was about, the latest chumrah of the day. But I personally, was very proud as a religious Jew, to see that Medinat Yisrael went to Nepal. Not necessarily the people with kippot on their heads. Right? The secular army, the secular government that was not motivated by quote unquote, Torah values, even though I think they were. Right? So what did they do? They went to Nepal. There were 250 doctors and medical practitioners. They treated 1,500 patients. They performed 90 life-saving surgeries. They delivered 8 babies. And they were able to keep alive the image of God in so many people. This was a real Kiddush Hashem. And I think of Rav Kook. Rav Kook had it right on this issue. Sometimes secular people are doing profoundly religious acts, but they don't know it. So the government of Israel, Tzahal, and the medical, I don't care whether they had kippot, they were wearing tzitzis, they did something profoundly religious, profoundly connected to Torah. And it's a great tragedy that the religious community doesn't feel the same kind of theological and Torah obligation to do so. So I would just close by saying this, that there's a poem that I love by John Donne. It's not a poem, it's a meditation. Right? And John Donne says as follows: "No man is an island. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee." We are all part of mankind. And when someone dies in Nepal, the bell tolls for us. And I think that the Torah teaching is even deeper than John Donne, because the Torah teaching is that each person reflects God. Each person is a part of Borei Shamayim Va'aretz. Each person reflects the image of God. Each person represents the image of God. And therefore, each person's death, whether it's a Jew or a Gentile, diminishes God and our ability to see a Kadosh Baruch Hu in the world. So I would say, in closing, that every Torah Jew, even though it's not the case, right? My dream is that every Torah Jew should have John Donne's religious insight inscribed into his heart, alongside Rabbi Akiva's great truth, that Chaviv Adam should live with itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Korn, Rabbi Nataf.
Thank you. I want to thank Rabbi Cardozo for organizing this evening. An issue of tremendous importance, an issue that has made it to the top of my personal agenda. And I want to thank you for coming, congratulate you for coming. I imagine probably a couple thousand people in Yerushalayim heard about this event, and you felt strongly enough about it to come. So I want to thank you for that, because I think it's really important. And if you feel that it's important, please make sure to let others know. Not necessarily to come to events like this, but let them know how you feel, because it's really something that there is not enough consciousness about. And I don't want to sound negative. I mean, Rabbi Lichtenstein used the word deplorable for the situation, and it is, but by the same token, I think the three of us tonight, and probably everyone in the audience as well, shares a great love for Torah Yisrael, for our Torah, from which these ethical values come from that we're discussing today, that it's not coming from the outside, but very much our reaction, our sense of something's wrong, comes from our deep involvement in Torah. As a student of Rav Lichtenstein, I know that this is one of the things that I took from him, to have that appreciation of being part of a larger world that Rabbi Korn spoke about before. So, and besides Torah Yisrael, we share a deep respect and love of Am Yisrael, who has endured so much persecution and is in trauma, as Rabbi Korn said. And on that level, it deserves a break, that it does take time. And our job really is to move things forward, to create awareness and knowledge about what Judaism's true message should be. And for me, perhaps reflecting again Rabbi Korn, I think the message is quite simple. And to introduce it, I'm going to say something perhaps a little shocking. I like to do that just to shake people up and make sure we've been through.
I put them to sleep.
That's right. No, it wasn't you. It's an hour in a warm room, so we need to say something that will shake people up. Just don't throw stones until you hear me out. The events in Nepal did not disturb me in the same way as Rabbi Cardozo mentioned. Our lack of response did not shake me, nor was I that impressed by the official Israeli response. And I'll tell you why I feel that way. As was mentioned, we're talking about 10,000 people that died from an unpredictable natural tragedy. I think it's really important to be aware of what the statistics of global deprivation and poverty and hunger are. And you would realize, and I'm going to quote you some statistics to back up what I'm saying, you realize that approximately that same number of children die of malnutrition, preventable disease every day. And for us as a nation to respond very admirably, because we have the expertise when there are calamities in various parts of the world, and to completely ignore, as most of the world, not only the Jewish world, not only the Orthodox world, but to completely ignore, or I shouldn't say completely ignore, but to be oblivious and not to realize the tremendous importance of the people that are dying across the world on a daily basis for reasons that are preventable. So let me give some statistics. This is from the World Bank, 2013. So we're talking about a year and a half. And Baruch Hashem, things are improving. Again, not necessarily as a result of the Jewish people or the Torah world. The United Nations, who we have issues with, has done an extremely admirable job in the last 15 years on this topic. In any case, statistics from the World Bank 2013 tell us that approximately 6 million children are dying before the age of 5 each year. And obviously most of these children are living in lesser developed countries. And the statistics in the developed world, in terms of mortality of children before they reach the age of 5, in Israel and in France, it's 4 out of 1,000. And there is natural, people die, old people and young people as well. And this is something we wish were not the case, but this is what is the situation in developed countries. In the United Kingdom, it's a little worse, it's 5. In the United States, it's 7, which is an interesting statistic. But let's take a look at the less developed countries. In Pakistan, it's 86. Right, it's about 20 times as many as in Israel. In Nigeria, it's 117. And Angola goes up to 167. And to change the sort of poverty that is causing these statistics, again, you can check the statistics, the United Nations, the World Bank, the OECD. We're talking that the United Nations has set up a benchmark that developed nations should be giving 0.7% of gross domestic product in order to, the idea was to alleviate the worst type of poverty by half by the year 2015, and Baruch Hashem, that has been achieved, not because nations have all met the standard, many have not, I should say most have not. The exceptions are predictably in Scandinavia and the United Kingdom. Those of you who are from England should know. But most nations have not met. Nonetheless, for all sorts of other reasons, the goal has been met. By very conservative estimates, it will cost the developed nations 2% of gross domestic product. Obviously, the burden can be shared according to income. Right? We all know what we pay in income tax to our own governments. It will take about 2% of the income or the gross domestic product of developed nations to get rid of most of this problem. Right? And again, we are completely oblivious to an issue that, as a person of faith, I think should be at the top of everybody's agenda, be it Orthodox Jew, be it liberal Jew, be it Christian, be it Muslim, being any person of faith. And I'm deeply disturbed by our lack of concern and awareness. Getting back to our own tradition, I think it goes beyond what Rav Lichtenstein said, and therefore one doesn't even have to get into the nitty-gritties of the Halacha. Rav Lichtenstein, in the quote that you have in front of you, spoke about the Gentile Avodat Hashem. But I think it's even more basic than that. It's not a question of whether the non-Jews are deeply religious people, or even whether they have the potential to be deeply religious people. It's about what our reaction should be to someone of the divine image in trouble. And for me, Rabbi Marcus Lehman, in his Agadah, says it very simply and profoundly. He says as follows, in speaking about what it means to open our door on Pesach. He says, if any person be hungry, let him come and eat. Not only friends, relations, and co-religionists, but anyone, even an opponent or an enemy. The mere fact that a person is hungry gives him the right to my help, whether he has earned it or not, whether he deserves it or not. And he beautifully uses the word right. The person who is hungry, a hungry individual, even an enemy, has the right, and therefore I have the obligation to try to meet that need, to be aware of that need. And Rabbi Marcus Lehman was not a controversial figure. It was an Aguda rabbi in Germany. He's a writer as well, more famous for his novels than as a rabbi, but certainly a serious scholar, and not by no means controversial. Perhaps he was echoing the general Hirschian flavor, a broader vision of Jewish interaction with the non-Jewish world. There are limits in Halacha. There are limits in terms of what Rabbi Cardozo mentioned before, the sort of lifestyle that was being led and encouraged by a pagan world. And if it exists today, we are in opposition to it. And certainly there are people that are so vicious and violent they're not included. But that's not the case for the vast majority of the people that we're speaking about today, that are hungry, that don't have clean water, that don't have medication, because the whole Western world is not concerned enough to do something about it. And yes, we do help, but not nearly enough when you think of the stakes. And for me, that's why this has to be at the top of our agenda as Jews. And I think there's another barrier here as Jews in terms of how to deal with this issue. And within the tradition, I think it's a very important reason why it's in the tradition. I think it's something that has value in our day as well, and that's the issue of prioritization. That you have a responsibility to the person that's closest to you, whether that be a family member, right? Anye ircha kodem, the notion in the Midrash that's brought in Halacha, that the people of your community come before the people of another community. But as the Khatam Sofer points out, that is when all other things are equal. And in Shuvah, Khatam Sofer says, that's, of course, you have to take care of your relative first, but that's assuming you're not buying your relative a Rolls Royce when the fellow next door is starving. It doesn't make sense. Again, one has to use seichel, one hides behind the halacha, as Rabbi Korn says. When things are intuitive, it's for a reason. Now, a different Jew said something very similar. That Jew's name is Peter Singer. I don't know how many of you have heard of him. He's a secular philosopher, utilitarian, one of the leading utilitarian philosophers from Australia. He happens to be Jewish. And even though I disagree with many of his views in other issues, I appreciate what he has done for global suffering, both as a writer and as an activist, which again is coming from the Torah, whether he realizes it or not. And he says as follows to all of us, Jew and non-Jew alike. He says if family and friends really need the money, in anything remotely the way those living extreme poverty need it, it would be going too much against the grain of human nature to object to giving to them before giving to strangers. Which for Singer is a problem. For Yahadut, it's not a problem. Human nature is what the Torah deals with. We can't deal with anything else. We're not malachim. However, he continues and says, fortunately, most middle-class people in rich nations, and I would include Israel, we weren't always, but we're now a rich nation. It's about time we get used to being one. He says most people, middle-class people in rich nations, don't have to make that choice. Right? As societies, we have enough to give to our families and to the stranger that needs it much more than our family. As a society, it's important to make the distinction, as most authorities in Halacha make, that there's a difference between effective giving and symbolic giving. As individuals, most of what we give in tzedakah is symbolic. But we don't really take care of the needs of any significant amount of individuals on our own. On the other hand, the community is usually able to give effectively for its community, for the poor in its community. And so the issue that I bring up, both as individuals, definitely as individuals, but even for Israel as a nation, is a symbolic issue. Israel on its own cannot change the situation that I've mentioned. We don't, if it costs the world 2%, we don't have that 2%. It's well beyond all of our domestic product. But as the term was mentioned before, the notion of Or LaGoyim speaks specifically about symbolism, about being an example. And we mentioned that 0.7%, right, less than 1% of GDP that's been recommended by the United Nations for each nation to give. And I mentioned before, very few nations come to that level, and the United States is doing quite poorly on that level, even though in terms of net amount it gives more than any other nation. The United States is actually at 0.2% as opposed to 0.7%. Okay, we're talking about, and we're talking about governmental giving. It doesn't include private giving, but again, anybody who's familiar with the statistics knows that private giving, by and large, is much, much less than governmental giving. There's obvious reasons for that. In any case, the statistic for Israel, who again does beautifully in sharing smart help, right? Jews have brains and we export that, and that's great. Right? We have technology and we use that for bracha, and that's great. But that doesn't mean not to give money as well. In any case, the statistics for Israel, unfortunately, again in 2013, was 0.07 of a percentage point. Right? In other words, less than 0.1% of the gross domestic product in Israel is given as official government aid, including the hospitals that were set up. I think Haiti was in 2013, if I'm not mistaken. Whatever it is, right, including all of that, that's what we're giving. I wrote an article, I think over a year ago, when Netanyahu met the Pope. And I said that his message to the Pope should be, we'll step up to the plate. We'll step up to the plate. Israel as a nation is going to step to the plate and be at the top of the list, whatever it takes. Not just in brain power, but also in raw numbers. Right? If Britain gives 0.07, Israel should give 1%. So what am I telling us? Again, symbolically, I'm not telling you to change your giving. Jewish giving is needed for Jewish causes. I think, of course, we can increase on that and give to other causes also, but ultimately, all of that is symbolic, so that's not what I'm advocating. What I am advocating is taking an active role in pressuring our governments, first and foremost, Israel, and that's what I would like to see the Orthodox community being at the forefront of, saying we need to take being Or L'Goyim seriously, we take Torah seriously, we take Judaism seriously, it's at the core of our essence, and we want the Israeli government to reflect that. We want the state of Israel to reflect that in a more serious way. And also in terms of the world community, those who are citizens in other nations, and as a citizen of the global community as well, to cry that the house is on fire and say that as religious Jews we cannot tolerate the situation, that we need things to be done. Again, there's much more to say. I've already overstepped my time, and I want to let other people a chance to speak as well. But I just hope that what I've said has touched your heart in such a way that you will do something with it, because Judaism is not just about machshava, it's about maaseh.
Thank you very much. Let me first of all make the following point. What we should focus on is not on what the Israeli society has done. We are speaking about, as I introduced, about the Orthodox community. The Israeli society has done, percentage-wise, and in the way how it made its point, extremely well. It could definitely do more than it has done. My point is that the Orthodox religious community, which is identified with the Jewish tradition, has been completely absent. That's the focus of this discussion. So I have a question, for example, to Rabbi Korn, and that is this. If it is true that we have been traumatized over all these years, and therefore we don't react well, why is it that the Israeli secular society was not traumatized about this matter? Because they did act, and we didn't. And I think that distinction is exactly the problem which we have. If both of them would not have done anything, we could have argued, all of us, after all of us have been in pogroms and or in holocausts before, then it would have made sense. It doesn't make any sense at all that the Israeli secular community is suddenly doing exactly the Jewish thing which needs to be done, while we on the other side as Orthodox Jews, are completely failing in this particular matter. This to me is absolutely unacceptable. Secondly, I do not agree with the two of you about one thing. Halacha has created culture. Don't underestimate, and there are many studies about this, Halacha over the 1,000 years created the very culture of what the Jewish tradition is all about. I'm not saying that everything within the Jewish tradition is Halacha, but it is definitely true that it played a major role in the way how our culture has come about. Now we have assimilated, we have gone beyond, and we are no longer part of the halachic world as our great-great-grandparents all were, but that doesn't mean to say that therefore we still have the after effects of what halacha did to us. But my point is that the halacha, as it is still this day applied, is not the halacha which should apply. It's not a matter of between yes halacha or no halacha. It is a question about what kind of halacha. And here we are incredibly failing. I give you one very harsh example. I wrote you about this a few days ago. Is I still don't understand why the halacha makes an incredible distinction between Jewish life and non-Jewish life if, for example, we speak about human organs and about human transplant. We don't allow any kind of autopsy to take place on a Jew. We do allow it on a non-Jew. In fact, what happens now at this moment is, if you are aware of what's going on, is that medical associations around the world are saying to us, listen, if you don't do autopsies and you don't allow for organ transplants, we are not going to provide you with our let's say limbs and parts and hearts and whatever it is, if you don't do the same. Well, we are not doing that. So I'm asking you one question. What's going on over here? How is that possible? And I haven't heard an answer to that particular question yet. Secondly, we are asking the question, if I agree once more with Rabbi Nataf, we should give more money, we should do more than that. But why is there no prayers for these people? Why is it that we have been completely silent about this issue? It doesn't help us to start saying it was because this or because of that reason. Yes, it was all because of it. But on the end of the day, we need to be an example to the world. We cannot say the non-Jews are not doing so well and therefore we also don't need to do so well. No, we have to be an example. That's the point of being Jewish. That's the point of being an Or like Eugene. We are failing this completely. And I can give you many more halachic and non-halachic cases where we make this distinction between Jews and non-Jews. And this is, in my opinion, because of the past, when indeed a cultural thing was expressed via and because of the halacha, which is saying, well, the life of a non-Jew is not as important as the life of a Jew, and therefore we make that distinction. And is it not high time now to make an end to that? I do not know halachically how to do that, but from a moral perspective, we have an enormous problem over here, and I haven't yet heard from any posek who really has dealt with that problem to the extent as you need to deal with. So let's be honest about it. We have problems. We have halachic problems. I think I know an answer to that is, and that halacha has to go. Why? Because it was something which was rooted in an old condition which no longer is part of the non-Jewish world and therefore should not be part of our Jewish world. But we are hiding behind something without being prepared to basically admit that there is something wrong. Once more, I want to repeat this once more. I'm a halachic Jew and I believe in halacha because I believe indeed it is redemptive. I believe indeed that it has tremendous opportunities to overcome these problems. What I'm asking is, since our poskim, our halachic authorities, our Rosh Yeshivot are not saying a word about this, leave it alone, it is not being discussed at all in the yeshiva world whatsoever, then obviously you continue a culture which is highly unhealthy by now. Halacha should change the culture and the condition in which we live. If we don't do that, then the halacha is failing, not because of the halacha itself, but because of the people who are applying halacha. And there, I think, the distinction has to be made. So I'm asking you once more, Rabbi Korn, why is it that the Israelis are not traumatized, and we, the Orthodox, are traumatized? And let me say it very harsh. Perhaps it is better to be a secular Israeli, because then I have more of a feeling towards the non-Jewish world than when I'm an Orthodox Jew and I'm caught up in this enormous problem. This, I think, is exactly the issue.
A few things. First of all, I think you're absolutely correct that the secular Israeli, even though according to Rav Kook they're not secular, they're doing God's work in many ways, but you know, the people who identify as secular are less traumatized than the religious community. And I think the answer is that all of the Jewish people received a very deep trauma from the Shoah and from the continued persecutions. But the religious community is doubly traumatized. Doubly traumatized. First is the trauma of the persecutions by the Gentile world. And the second is the trauma of modernity. The trauma of enlightenment and modernity and the challenge of secular authority to religious authority. And that's why you see an increasing building of the walls, not only between Jews and Goyim, right, but between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, between religious Jews and secular Jews, because they see secular Jews as representatives of modernity that challenge religious authority, and they cannot handle this challenge of religious authority. And therefore, because secular Jews want to participate more in modernity, in universalism, they have the religious ability to feel the suffering of the Gentiles. So this is a great paradox. This is a tragic paradox. That the people with kippot on their heads, who study Torah all day, many of them, not all of them, but many of them, have left God's world. You know, that God is only in the Daled Amos of Halacha or in the Beis Medrash. And they've left the rest of God's universe, whereas the secular Israelis understand that there's a world out there that they want to participate in. So the religious community is doubly traumatized, doubly wounded, doubly deficient, I would say. They can't handle relationship with Gentiles, and they can't handle the challenge of modernity.
But is not the Rosh Yeshivot, the poskim, the great leaders, are them? They not the ones who have to push that and say,
that's
this
true.
is what needs to happen.
You know, there's an expression in America that communities get the rabbis they deserve.
Exactly.
So, I'm part of the community that always said the poskim need to do this and the poskim need to do that. Well, guess what, folks? Unless we push the poskim and demand the poskim to change, they're not going to do it, right? Because they have vested interest in the status quo. That's where they have the power, that's where they have the control. So we have the responsibility to push them and to tell them this is simply unacceptable. Don't expect the change to come from them. It's got to come indigenously from the people. Now, you do point to a very great problem about that. There are certain distinctions between Jews and Goyim in the Halacha, right, that seem to be not only unacceptable, just flat out immoral. Flat out immoral and unethical. I know that's shocking to a religious person, but I feel this very deeply. But about the issue of organ transplant, just let me say, if you go through the tshuvot of organ transplants, it was never, for the majority of the poskim, there may be one exception out there, but it was never about that a Jew can't donate organs to a Gentile. Right? That was not what it was about. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who was the major posek in this area, at least in Israel, said that Jews can't even donate organs to other Jews in Israel, in Medinat Yisrael. He was against all organ transplants for brain dead people. That's really where the ballgame is for brain dead people. It wasn't about whether the recipient is a guy or a Jew. It was that you couldn't do it as a Jew, and you couldn't allow the doctor, to commit the severa of prematurely killing the brain dead person who was a suffix gosei, suffix may, suffix chai, whatever. You need not go through the particulars. So it was not about who's a Jew and who's a guy. That was not the issue.
But that may be true. But what did happen was that the religious community did not react on that. It didn't
Correct.
do what Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach said, and now we are actually
Because-
in a problem that indeed
there,
the other
yes.
side says
So
we
there
don't
is
do
a
it for
perfect
you either.
example. There is a perfect example of how the good people of the society, both religious and non-religious, demanded a change in the psak. Because in 1988, because of public pressure, the Rabbanut paskind that brain death constitutes a halachic death, and therefore, and that opened the door to organ transplants. Why did they do this? Because to the merit of the Rabbanut, they understood that if they don't do this, more than 100 citizens of Medinat Israel will die every year for lack of an organ. That's enormous moral pressure, and I would say halachic pressure, because the death of any human being and the death of any citizen of the state of Israel is a great tragedy. We have to tear kriya for such a thing.
Forgive me
Right? So
Yes.
it was because of the public pressure. It wasn't that somebody went into a Beit Midrash and figured out a chiddush in the halacha. Right? The halacha emerged as a result of the social and economic and moral pressure, right, of the society, and that's what we have to do to the halachic leaders. Now, it's true. You're absolutely right that halacha influences culture. Absolutely true, but it's a two-way street. It's a two-way street. When I was in yeshiva, I used to learn that, all the changes in halacha that occurred in the late Middle Ages in Ashkenaz regarding Christians, right, was because of a chiddush, that somebody learned the Tosfos and got a chiddush that you can go into partnership with Christians now, right, because of this great svara that somebody got in the Beis Medrash. That's not the way halacha works. What happened is that the Jewish communities in Ashkenaz, in Germany, in France, in Italy were very small, and they were economically dependent upon financial and commercial intercourse with the Christian community. And they understood that if they would not go into partnership with Christians, they would die. And therefore they went into partnership with Christians in violation of the letter of the law. So along came Tosfos, along came the Ri, along came the Rabbeinu Tam, and they said, we have to look at the halacha anew, right? Because there's no way we can survive, and Jews are doing this anyway. So it was the social reality that changed the halacha. We are responsible for the social reality. We are responsible for changing the culture and making the moral demands and the correct demands upon the poskim. That's the way halacha works.
Let me ask you one question. The reason why, this is unpleasant to say this, but I want to be honest. The reason why it was that they permitted autopsies to rabbis was because they were concerned that there wouldn't be any organs for Jews. So it was done from our perspective, for our benefit. The question was not that we do this for the Goyim. We didn't do the other side of the story. We did it because if we don't give it to them, then they won't give it to us, right? But that means to say the concern was first of all with the Jew. It was not a question about whether or not we should give organs to save a non-Jewish life. That was the reason why this happened. That was the psak all about. In other words, it's mi penei ha'eva, as we say. Basically, it is on the end of the day, we have to think about how do we
It's about self-interest,
sure-
but not about moral principle. But it's about self-interest.
It's self-interest. That's basically what it is. So I'm asking. That means to say that the distinction, even when you do the autopsies, the distinction is still there. You are not concerned about non-Jewish life. You're concerned about Jewish life, and for that you need to make an appeal, or better, you have to make some kind of a compromise with the non-Jewish world, otherwise we are in trouble. But that's not the issue here. The issue is they are in trouble.
Well, first of all, I think there's two issues. Autopsies don't have anything to do with organ transplants. When somebody's dead and you're about to do an organ transplant and about to do an autopsy on him, the organs don't work anymore.
No,
right?
that's true, but
Okay.
there's something else here. Autopsies for a long time now, there's much less, was at the time a way to find out, to discover a lot of medical problems,
Yes,
right?
yes, that's
we
why we
didn't
do
allow
autopsies.
this to be happened on us. We only said, let the Goyim do that, and we will look to their bodies, but we won't use our bodies for that.
Right.
What's
So
going
that-
on?
So, but, you know, Rav Kook, who was a great universalist in many ways, you know, but he drives everybody mad because he has all these contradictions in his
Absolutely.
writings. Rav Kook wrote about universal humanity, right? But when it came to the autopsies issue,
was
you're
against it.
absolutely right. He said, you know, he understood Israeli medical schools need to do autopsies, right? To save Jews. So he said, if you have to do autopsies, it's much better to do an autopsy on a Gentile than to do it on a Jew, because Jews have a greater tzelem Elokim. So
you know what you're
here's
saying?
you get the, you're right. So that's, you know, today I think that would be unacceptable. You know, I'll just tell you one thing. In the 1950s, I think it was 58, there was a Rav Rosenthal in Israel, right, who understood, a famous man. He was a great Talmud Chacham, and he dealt with the problem of Hatzalat Goy b'Shabbat that you alluded to. Right? And he said, in the classic, the problem is as follows: are you allowed to save a Gentile life on Shabbat? Are you allowed to be Mechalel Shabbat, to violate Shabbat, to save a Gentile life? Now, Lefi Hadin, in the perfect world, the answer is no. You're not allowed to, but you're allowed to save a Jewish life. And however, that was not normative halacha. Normative halacha was you do save the Gentile life, mipnei eva, right? Because if you don't save the Gentile life, they will get angry at us and they will persecute us, and that will cause Jewish death. Right? So we're good moral accountants here, or utilitarian accountants, right? We say, well, we really should not save the life, but we do it because if we don't do it, then they're going to kill us. So that's a thoroughly, that's a utilitarian argument from self-interest. It's not about the principle of the life of the Gentile. So I venture to say, I would guess, that nearly everybody in this room feels that the issue really is the life of the Gentile. The issue is not, well, you know, how can we calculate the safest society for Jews? So Rav Rosenthal in the 50s actually wrote a long tshuva on this. And he said, in the era, right, of universal human rights and universal recognition of the worth of human rights, we should dispense with mipnei eva. Right? The real issue is the kedusha of the life of the Gentiles. And I think on moral grounds he was absolutely correct. But it wasn't accepted in the religious world. Not yet. I think it will be accepted yet.
When we press button.
Right. I heard of a story from authentic, you know, it's a true story. I heard it from 3 people, that when Rav Soloveitchik was talking about this issue, he paskined early in the 50s that Jewish doctors go to the hospital, drive to the hospital and drive home from the hospital because of pikuach nefesh, the saving the life, and it didn't matter whether it was a Gentile or a Jew. And he said, you know, you have to save the life of the Gentile, mipnei eva. So some chutzpahdik student in his shir said, does that satisfy you morally? So Rav Soloveitchik says, no, it doesn't. And then he proceeded to lay out a theory, a la the Meiri, of reciprocity, and that in today, it's exactly what you said, Rav Cardozo, that in today's day and age, where you have a Gentile who respects the life of the Jew, we have to respect the life of the Gentile, and therefore, you know, it's l'chatchila we should say. Unfortunately, he never wrote that down. And the sad story about Rav Rosenthal, he was basically, as my philosophy teacher used to say, he was kicked out of the religious dormitory.
Right.
You know, he was really mercifully attacked by the religious community because they couldn't understand how you could change the Halacha.
Well, that's where the problem lies.
So I'm not saying that we have no problems. We have very, very deep problems. But once again, I think the problem is not the Halacha. The problem is the culture, the narrowness of our culture. And we, as concerned, sensitive religious Jews, have to push the religious authorities to make the Halacha more in line with our moral values. That's the only way.
Nataf.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. That again, you're correct that the Halacha influences the tarbut, the culture. But I think again, if you look at the sources, what it brought from Rabbi Lehman is based on the issue of Darchei Shalom, which is the basic pillar of where the bottom line that everybody agrees to, that's nifsak Halacha, it's in the Rambam, it's in the Shulchan Aruch, that we have to help non-Jews to live with us because of Darkei Shalom, and it's brought out both in the Rambam himself and others after him that this is an ethical value. It's not simply out of a utilitarian stake that we have. So that even without the Meiri, even without all sorts of radical revision of Halacha, I think the bottom line is that Jews have more of an obligation towards non-Jews than we participate in. And that to me is entirely cultural. I'll tell you a story. I gave a talk about this in Manchester. I was driving with a modern Orthodox Jew who said to me, I mean, he was a very, he was a learned man, and extremely culturally Jewish. And he said to me, I don't like giving to non-Jews. He says, I'll listen to what you have to say, but I don't like giving to non-Jews. He said, I even asked a posek, and it's spoken about a Haredi posek that he went to, do I have to give to non-Jews? And the posek said, of course you have to, it's Darkei Shalom. So the truth is that even taking a very conservative but correct understanding of the Halacha, I think that our obligation far surpasses that which we're involved in. And I would beg to differ on the great Kiddush Hashem of Medinat Yisrael. In Kol HaKavod, I don't think it's there. I think it's a busha. I think that Israel is a rich nation. We can do a lot more. The fact that we send our technology, it's been attacked on the left as propaganda seeking. I wouldn't go that far. I don't think it's all about propaganda and public relations. But if the nikudah of giving, the universalist nikudah of giving to all created human image is there by the secular, there's a lot more that we could do. And the fact that nations like Denmark and Sweden spend 15 times as much as the state of Israel, we're not poor. Right? I know what the difference is between our standard of living and theirs. I imagine it's not very great. Right? All sorts of excuses can be made. But la'aniyut da'ati, it's a busha. And as far as what you mentioned what the Orthodox attitude has to be, even being conservative small c, and taking an Orthodox position, we should be very upset about this, and we should be at the forefront of making a change.
Now, I would only add to that, I fully agree with you. Perhaps the Jewish state has not done enough, but then it means to say, kal vachomer dat de Orthodox haven't done enough.
That's true.
This is a big point. Friends, we'll stop here. I just want to finish with an observation by the Malbim, the famous great Malbim, Pirush on the whole of the Torah and of Tanakh, on the following pasuk. At least we should finish on a high note. He says something very beautiful. In Malachi, one of the prophets, it says like this. I will read you straight away in English. From the rising of the sun to its settings, my name, that means God's name, is great among the nations. In every place, incense is offered to my name. In every place, incense, ketoret, is offered to my name. And a pure offering for my name is great among the nations, says the Lord of hosts. Comes the Malbim, hear this. What does this mean? Hear this. From the rising sun to its setting, also all the nations are idol worshippers, still my name is great among the nations. Why? Because all of them know that there is a first cause hovering over all of them, and they call it the God of gods. Only they say that it is not in according to his honor, the honor of God, of our God, to deal with the low world, and therefore he, that means God, leaves the issue of running the world to his servants, like kings do, and that is the reason why they serve idols. What is he saying? When you are busy with idol worship, in according to the Malbim, you're actually worshipping God. Why? Because they consider these idols nothing else but the servants of the ultimate God, And therefore the Pasuk in Malachi says, wherever you go, in every place, including Nepal, in Hinduism and Buddhism, on the end of the day, all their service is to me. It's not right, because it should go straight to me. But don't forget, they mean well. And that's another reason to go to Nepal and to help them out. I thank you very much. Yes.
I think we can all agree that. I think we can all agree that all human suffering is a problem, and human suffering is not just limited to an earthquake in Nepal. It extends to every single human experience of suffering, and obviously that should, every time we hear about it, that should pain all of us. The fact that human suffering is so widespread that all 7 billion people in the world suffer at some point in their lives, all kinds of different sufferings. Obviously death is the worst one, but there are all kinds of sufferings. It's obvious that any one person or even a group of a large number of people are unable to deal with all of that suffering. And obviously, we spoke about balances, but we have to try and maintain for ourselves priorities. Do you not think that it's reasonable that as a nation, we first focus on the suffering of those within our nation? Like, it's quite normal for members of a family to focus on the suffering of those within their family. Given that Judaism is more like a tribe or something, kind of big extended family, which is even stronger bond in a nation, does it not make sense that to an extent we focus a lot of our care, compassion, not like compassion in terms like a theoretical sense, like I feel compassion for everyone who suffers in the world, but we wouldn't be able to live if we were constantly thinking about everyone's suffering that happens all the time. So we have to focus on people suffering to a certain extent. Is it not a reasonable circle of, I don't know how to say it, but circle of suffering to focus on that of our nation? And therefore is it not such a, obviously all suffering is bad and we should try and help everyone, but is it so terrible that you can say?
I think no doubt the Halacha, and I think it was mentioned before, is that every person has a priority towards his family, to the city where he lives, the country where he lives, and that also applies in the case of the Jewish people. Sure, we have first to look after our poor people and the people are suffering, but that does never exclude within Jewish law that we should also not care about others, because there's a priority, but after that priority has somehow been looked after, then we still have an obligation to go for the larger world as well. So yes, priority is true, but priority cannot be used therefore to say that we don't care about the others.
No, that we
It
don't
just
care.
means first. That's all what it means.
Your last point about pagans somehow being true worshippers begs the question of atheists and pagans. Where do they come in this? We've been talking about comparative religions, but until 100 years ago there were not many atheists in the world. But today, especially in Europe, in the post-Christian era, they may even be the majority for all I know.
There is the Gaon of Vilna at a certain point, I still want to explain you, says that it is remarkable that atheists are normally very good behaving people of great integrity. That's what he writes in Mishlei. And he says the reason why that is because since they don't have to focus on God and put a lot of koach, a lot of strength in looking after him, they have more to look after their fellow man. It's a very interesting observation being made there. I would say that atheists today, whether or not they really exist, which I doubt very much, but even when they are really there, they fall under the same law, like the Malbim describes, because whether or not they believe in gods, or they believe in our God, or they believe in an other value, ultimately, when it is for the good, it is a form of serving God. That I think is what he's trying to say over here. Yes?
I wanted to point out, to add to the list of the very small list of Orthodox authorities that really spoke or speak usually about disasters that occur to non-Jews. There is this small community of Italy which is usually a little forgotten in the entire Orthodox Jewish world. But typically and traditionally, the rabbis in Italy have spoken always, like they stood out to express their support, and most recently it wasn't about Nepal, but it was about the hundreds of migrants who died in the Mediterranean every week. Well, it's not recent, but recently the chief rabbi of Rome like publicly defined this as a Jewish problem. So there is some hope there.
There was a very famous Italian rabbi by the name of Eliyahu ben Namozek, who wrote in great lengths about this particular issue, and he constantly emphasized this particular point. But again, ask a yeshiva bocher if he ever heard about Rabbi ben Namozek, and I can tell you that he has never read about it.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. It's a matter of education.
It's an unknown
I'd like to ask you, you seem to focus on the issue of us previously viewing that as of the Avodah. If we look at the halachas around the Ger Toshav, which for sure they're not on the Avodah, they should be okay. The halachas, I know the Torah goes into depth and talks about how we have to treat them well, but still the halachas are not so great. For instance, you mentioned the mitzvah in the Torah of not doing favors to Jews. Chazal actually understand that to mean not to give a ger, specifically ger toshav land in Eretz Yisrael. So even without this concept of Avodah Zarah, we still seem to have this attitude toward non-Jews. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think you're misquoting the Halacha. You know, there's a Masechet Gerim that talks about the Halachot of Ger Toshav. And it's pumfel keret, the way as they say it in the Vatican. There's a chiyuv on Jews, Torah Jews, to ensure that Gerei Toshav have decent land in the Jewish polity. Okay. The Isur of Lo Techanim really had to do with people who were not Gerei Toshav, and it probably only applies to real idolaters, because the Isur in Devarim has to do with the Sheva Amamim. Right? Now, first of all, just as a technical point, and it's a very large point, Avodah Zarah does not mean idolatry. Right? It could include idolatry, but it doesn't mean idolatry only. It means illegitimate religion. Illegitimate religion. In the ancient time, in the pagan time, it was Avodah Zarah is when you worship some trees or stars or something physical that's not God. That's real idolatry. Okay? But if you look at the way the term Avodah Zarah is used, it means something that is prohibited by the Halacha. That's why something can be Avodah Zarah for us, like the Trinity. But according to the majority of Chachmei Ashkenaz, it's not Avodah Zarah for Christians, right? Because it's illegal for us, it's not illegal for them. So it doesn't only mean idolatry, it's a legal standard. That's really what it is. But your point is very good. The way out of this problem, I think, Rav Cardozo, is to extend this halachic category of Ger Toshav.
Exactly.
Right, on a universal level. And in fact, Rav Lichtenstein implies that. He wrote an article about philanthropy, about Jewish responsibility for philanthropy, and he says there in his own quiet way that the fact is that we are obligated to be philanthropic toward the Ger Toshav, that is, the non-Jew living within the Jewish polity that's run by Halacha, and that maybe should be extended to all Gentiles everywhere who are civil people. So there is this category of Ger Toshav, which remains to be explored within Halacha. And I think that would be the right moral direction to move in. Let's try to understand Gentiles who are civilized, who are moral people, be they atheist or not atheist, as Gerei Toshav. They fall under the Halacha category. And we, as Halachic Jews, as Torah Jews, have the obligation l'hachioto, to support them, to sustain them, to protect them. Okay. That's the move that's yet to be made within Halacha, but it's there. The potential is there. We just have to activate it.
The Remo Rabbi Moshe Isserles, in his commentary on the Shulchan Aruch in Yoredea, more or less says this. He says, he quotes it, but he's a little ambivalent about it, but he's mainly saying that perhaps we should look to the non-Jew today. He's speaking there about Yain Mesech, whether or not we can drink the wine after they have touched it. And there he nearly makes the point that we should look to them as today, as Kerei Toshav, and therefore, perhaps, we can drink the wine even after they've touched it.
Right. But once again, I would say, how is it that the people at this table want to move halacha in this direction, which is a perfectly legitimate halachic way to think, and yet so much of the religious world doesn't want to touch this, wants to go in the other direction? The answer is not what's in the halacha. The answer is what kind of culture are we living in? Are we living in a culture that wants to embrace the world and embrace humanity? Or are we living in a culture that is so traumatized that we want to stay as far away from humanity as possible? That's not a halachic issue, that's a psychic issue, that's a cultural issue. And that's where the work really needs to be done.
Bill.
At least you have the privilege to have a couple of non-Jews in the audience. That's me and my wife. We follow the 7 mitzvot b'nei Noach. I think you are completely right. The inwardness of the Orthodox Judaism is the biggest problem to communicate with the non-Jewish world. I have some example, and Rabbi Cardozo knows the example also, but nice to see you, knows the situation. When David Cardozo came, a man, an Orthodox rabbi, when he came 20 years ago for the first time to Holland, he had to ask his rabbi, can I go to Holland, because there are so few Jews living there, many are Christians, and they want to baptize us or they want to kill us, so can I go? And now we are the most closest friends you ever can imagine, so how can you break through this situation? Another example is that I have a very good relationship with the 8th generation descendant of Yimach Moshe living here in Jerusalem. How come? When you communicate with each other, you talk with each other, then if you know each other, you can love each other, and if not, so what can you do and leave the poskim what they are, push the poskim to change the situation, and that's the inwardness, that's the biggest problem, I think. When you come to the situation, you will feel that there's not so much problem with non-Jews.
Yes, I think it's the personal exposure. I mean, you quoted the Meiri. So, just very short. Rambam, Maimonides, had a very harsh views of Christians and Christianity. For him, it really was idolatry. But interestingly, the Rambam, Maimonides, never lived in a Christian country. He only lived he was here 9 months in Crusader Palestine, right? But then he left quickly. He couldn't survive here. But he was born in Muslim Spain. He went to Muslim the Maghreb in northern Africa, and then he lived the rest of his life outside of Cairo in Fustat. He never lived with Christians. Therefore, he could afford to have a very hostile, almost demonic notion of Christianity. In contrast, there was Menachem HaMeiri, who lived in Provence, not long after the Rambam, 1 generation after the Rambam. And he had very deep relationships with religious Christians. He wrote a book called Chibur HaTshuvah that he says in the introduction he wrote it because he was inspired by his conversations with a Christian priest. Right? So it's the personal exposure. Where do you meet God in another person? You meet God through the personal exposure. And that does more than anything else. And once that happens, the halacha will follow.
You have to come on Aliyah.
We need people like you.
Any more questions? Last question for Rabbi Nataf. Zoo.
Okay. We talked a lot about, it seems sort of an assumption throughout the discussion about the Kiddush Hashem that is being done by secular part of the state of Israel. And when it comes to the disaster relief that we do, I have to agree about that. However, and we also talked about the suffering and the trauma from that suffering and how that can cause a distancing of helping non-Jews. I'm trying to work out how the attitude to non-Jewish refugees changed between Menachem Begin, who took a boatload of Vietnamese people out of the South China Sea, to Miri Regev, who said the Sudanese are a cancer in our nation, which is what he said about the Jews, and to a religious Jew, Eli Yishai, who was sort of as Minister of the Interior at the time, spearheaded this attitude to keeping the Sudanese and Eritrean refugees out of Israel, or including sending them back to places where they clearly face persecution. So I'm trying to reconcile that with this praise and really and Menachem Begin, who as we know was very traumatized by his family's experience in the Holocaust. It was clear to him, and yet fast forward a few decades and we have a very different attitude.
Rabbi Nataf, just to resolve that problem.
I think again the state of Israel has always held in a symbolic way when it's been easy, and the Vietnamese boat people were easy.
Yeah.
The black Hebrews who came at the same time were not easy. And it had nothing to do with their skin color. They were difficult people. They were difficult to integrate. And the Sudanese are difficult to integrate also. I'm not sure, again, I'm not convinced that that secular Israel is a model of morality. I think it has done some very beautiful things, and we're all proud of those things when they happen. I think the general culture, be it secular, be it religious, is very insular, and being in the geopolitical situation that we're in Israel is not helping matters. We mentioned before the personal contact. Unfortunately here, the personal contact that most young people go through in the army with non-Jews is not positive. And outside the army is fairly limited, partly because we're involved in geopolitical conflict where the Arabs, which are the vast majority of non-Jews, are ambivalent towards us, we're ambivalent towards them in the best case scenario. And it's no coincidence that the people on this panel are from the West, and the rabbis that come generally to posit a more positive approach toward non-Jews come from nations where there's more interaction between Jews and non-Jews, be it in Western Europe and generally not Eastern Europe, as a matter of fact, be it from the Sephardi world, from North Africa and the Middle East. So there is this big problem that after all is said and done, you have some well-meaning chutznikim who have a vision of what we sincerely believe is at the bedrock of Judaism, and as Rabbi Cardozo mentioned, is not developed properly in the Halacha. We see that as very straight and to the point, and not some sort of contortion of Halacha. But whether that's really going to impact, I wrote, when revolutionize passed away, I wrote about this as well in the Times of Israel. How much has revolutionize influenced this nation after being here for many decades? And certainly he did a lot, but in comparison with the competition in the Dati Lumi world, it's not there. So again, I think that this, my personal take is, let's go with something that should be easy. Let's not try to work in things that are too difficult. Basic suffering, basic starvation should be something that we can agree upon as a bad thing. We don't have to like non-Jews. That's what Rabbi Lehman says. They can be your enemy, they can be undeserving. And I think that's the ethic that has to be brought out. I'm not going to argue with the person who likes the non-Jew, hates the non-Jew, loves the non-Jew. I mean, ideally I have a vision which I have in common with these two gentlemen and most of you. But let's put the ideal aside. The house is on fire in a way that we can do something about before we make decisions about the halacha in a way that should be obvious to all Israelis, secular or religious. And I think that's where we have to start.
The Gera Rebbe once said one of the biggest problems in Israel is that the Goyim in the street are also Jews. There's a lot of profundity to that statement. We thank you very much. Hope to see you. Chag Sameach. Hope to see you back.